In the first year, we've dealt with labor markets in a competitive environment. But in the second year, we deal with labor markets where there's monopsony power, where there's only one buyer of that factor, input or labor. Now, if that is the case, then in that market or in the labor market, we deal only with the one factor market, that is a labor market. Then that one buyer have got the power to influence the wage rate in that market, because it's the only buyer of labor in that, or the only employer of labor in that area, maybe a mine or whatever. Right now, what is important is, because we will look at, later on we will look at minimum wage that is imposed in a perfect competitive market, what effect does it have, and then compare it with the minimum wage in a monopsonistic labor market. But before you can understand that, you need to understand if there's a monopsonistic labor market, then how is the number, what is the wage rate that is determined, and you compare it with a perfect competitive firm, and then also what is the amount of labor, of units of labor that will be employed. Now, if a firm has monopsony power, that means it's the only employer of labor in that area or whatever, then we talk about two curves that is important here, or the marginal expenditure curve, and we've studied that, is the cost of employing one more unit of labor, and then you have the average expenditure curve, which is also the supply curve of labor, which is the average price that you paid to labor. And then you have your demand curve, which is also your marginal revenue product curve, that is downward sloping, and this is also the marginal value curve. So these are basically the three curves that is important here. And you must go back in this chapter and look at what is the ME curve, what is the AE curve, and what is the MV curve. And when we look at the monopsonistic labor market, the marginal expenditure curve will always rise above the average expenditure curve. And you can see it in the diagram. The marginal expenditure curve lies above the average expenditure curve, which is the supply curve of labor SL, which is, at that wage rate, how much labor will be supplied to the firm. Remember, we're talking about the labor market. Who supply labor is the workers, and who demands labor is firms. So the supply of labor is also the average expenditure curve of labor for the firm. And then you have the downward sloping demand curve, which shows the demand for labor from the firm. So you have got the supply, that red one, and then the demand for labor, which is also the MV curve of labor. Now, what is important here is that why will the marginal expenditure curve rise above the average expenditure curve? Because under monopsonistic labor market, if you want to employ an additional unit of labor, an extra unit, you have to not only to pay for that unit of labor a higher wage or higher price, because the price of labor is the wage, but you have to pay all units the higher price. And this is the reason why the marginal expenditure curve lies above the average expenditure curve. Because if you employ an additional unit of labor, you're not only going to pay the higher wage to that additional unit of labor, but to all other units of labor in that firm. So this is the reason why that curve lies above the average expenditure curve. Now, what is the number of units that the firm will employ, or what is the number of units of input in terms of labor? That will be determined by the intersection of the marginal revenue product, the MRP curve, that blue line, the demand curve or the MV curve, and the marginal expenditure curve, which is upward sloping, the ME curve. So you can see at the intersection there, that dotted line, that is then, and you come down to the horizontal axis. So how many units will be employed at this? It's 4, right? So that will be the amount of units that will be employed under monopsonistic labor market conditions. If it was a perfect competitive labor market, it will employ where we find LC, that broken line. So it's between 5 and 6. So the number of workers employed under perfect competition in the labour market is higher than under monopsonistic labour market, and you can see it there. In terms of the wages, the corresponding wage rate for perfect competition is WC. But the corresponding wage rate, and that is where if you move up between 5 and 6 up till point C, where it intersects the SL curve, the supply of labour curve, and then horizontally you move to the price per unit, which is the wage rate. The wage rate that will be determined or that will be paid for a perfect competitive labour market will be WC. But for monopsonistic labour market, you will see it will be lower. W asterisk only 13. Whereas it will be for WC, it will be between 13 and 15, maybe 14 per unit. So where if you go up with the vertical or the broken line from 4, which is the number of units that will be employed, and then you get the corresponding wage rate up till the supply curve of labour, which is SL, and then horizontally you will see that the monopsonist will pay only $13 or rand per unit, and that is less than the perfect competitive firm. So that is, how the number of units of labour will be determined in a monopsonistic labour market and the corresponding wage rate. And you can see it's lower than a perfect competitive labour market, that is the wage rate, and also the number of labour that will be employed is also lower. So this is important in terms of going forward. And then also what is important is when will the monopsonist labour market or the firm in that market maximize net benefit. They will employ more labour until the marginal value is equal to the marginal expenditure. Or in a labour market setup, in a factor market, until if MV is equal to ME, then ME is also equal to MRP. And if you go back to the MRP curve there, the MRP curve is also the marginal value curve. So this is the equilibrium condition for a monopsonistic labour market. They will employ labour until the marginal value is equal to the marginal expenditure, or until the MV is equal to, which is equal to ME, is equal to the MRP, which is also equal to MV. So this condition is very, very important in terms of the monopsonistic labour market. So what is important is now we've laid the basis to look at if a minimum wage is imposed in a monopsonistic labour market, what effect will it have on unemployment? And you remember in a perfect competitive market in first year, it leads to, you look at the example of the farm workers, the strike that happened last year, that if there's a minimum wage imposed, then it will lead to higher unemployment or retrenchment of some of the workers. But what is interesting, in a monopsonistic labour market, if a minimum wage is imposed above the equilibrium wage, then it will lead to less unemployment. Thank you.